Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and unusual colonial documents produced in the Andes, El primer nueva corónica y buen gobierno, the first new chronicle and good government. Now this manuscript runs to nearly 1200 pages and includes 398 illustrations. It was written around 1615 by an indigenous Andean author named Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, and it was addressed directly to King Philip III of Spain. Now, Guaman Poma devoted years of his life to compiling it. The work is part history, part moral critique, part political petition, and part visual record. It is a text that forces us to rethink how we understand Spanish colonial rule in the Andes. Now, the title page presents the work's name and its author, El primer nueva corónica y buen gobierno, written by Don Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, and the illustration displays a clear hierarchy of authority. At the top sits the Pope on a throne labeled Santidad. Below him appears the King of Spain, kneeling in prayer with his crown removed, acknowledging the Pope's spiritual authority. And at the bottom of the page, Guaman Poma includes a self-portrait of himself. Guaman Poma addressed the manuscript directly to the king. In one passage, he introduces himself with striking humility. I, Don Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, poor Indian and servant of your majesty, present this chronicle of the kingdom and its great miseries. On one level, he presents himself as a loyal subject reporting abuses within the empire. On another level, he is making a bold intellectual claim that an indigenous Andean can tell the history of the Andes more truthfully than Spanish chroniclers. Guaman Poma lived under colonial rule, yet he produced an enormous chronicle addressed to the king himself. He speaks, but in Castilian Spanish, a language imposed by colonial power and not fully his own. His critique is therefore both daring and carefully framed. He denounces corrupt officials, priests, and settlers, yet couches his critique as a loyal appeal to royal justice. What we see here is a colonized voice navigating power, criticizing domination while still operating within the political language of empire. The manuscript itself never reached the king. Instead, it disappeared for centuries and was rediscovered in the Royal Library of Copenhagen in 1908 by a German scholar named Richard Pichman. Today, the entire manuscript has been digitized and is freely available online, making it one of the richest surviving indigenous voices from colonial Latin America. The Nueva Corónica is a sprawling work, and it contains a long chronicle of Andean history, including pre-Inca and Inca societies, a narrative of the Spanish conquest and colonial rule, a denunciation of abuses by colonial priests, officials, and encomenderos, and a proposal for good government in which the Spanish king would rule justly, protect indigenous people, and reform colonial administration. Now, one of the most striking features of the manuscript is its illustrations. Guaman Poma filled the text with black and white drawings depicting everyday Andean life as well as the violence and exploitation of colonial rule. These images function almost like political cartoons, visual arguments that reinforce and intensify the critique in the text. It's important to note that Guaman Poma was not advocating independence from Spain. Instead, he called for reform, what he described as good government. Now, his hope was that the king would intervene to correct abuses committed by the colonial officials. The manuscript's journey remains something of a mystery. Historians still debate how it ended up in Denmark. Some scholars suggest that it may never have left Peru and was intercepted or discarded before reaching Spain. Others believe it may have arrived in Spain but was ignored, eventually entering European collecting networks and later Danish royal collections. In any case, there is no evidence that the king or Spanish authorities ever read it. And ironically, this failure may have ensured its survival. Had the manuscript circulated widely in Lima or Madrid, it might have been censored, edited, or destroyed. Instead, stored quietly in Copenhagen, it remained intact for nearly 3 centuries. Guaman Poma claimed he was writing for the king, but in a sense, he was also writing for posterity, preserving an indigenous account of colonial rule for future generations. When historians describe the Nueva Corónica as one of the most important indigenous critiques of colonialism, it is not because it shaped policy at the time. It did not. Its importance lies in the window it gives us today into how an indigenous Andean intellectual understood the colonial world and imagined justice within it. But rather than simply describing the manuscript, we should approach it the way historians do, as a primary source. And that means asking questions. Who wrote it? Why was it written? What message does it convey? And how do we interpret its images and words? And what does the document reveal? And what might it leave out? To answer these questions, we first need to understand the author and the colonial world in which he lived. Guaman Poma was likely born around the 1530s or 1540s, only a few years after Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire. In other words, he grew up in the immediate aftermath of conquest, when Andean society was undergoing profound upheaval. The Spanish imposed new systems of tribute and labor. Indigenous communities were required to provide labor in mines and farms and workshops. And one of the most notorious systems was the mita, a rotating labor draft that forced indigenous men to work in mines such as Potosi under extremely harsh conditions. At the same time, colonial authorities reorganized indigenous settlements. In the 1570s, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo implemented a program known as the Reducciones. Indigenous communities were forcibly resettled into planned towns to facilitate tribute collection, evangelization, and administrative control. The colonial system also relied heavily on indigenous leaders known as curacas, and these local elites helped organize tribute payments and labor drafts. Some Andean nobles retained influence by working within the colonial system. Others lost power and land as Spanish settlers expanded. Guaman Poma came from a family that claimed noble Andean ancestry, and he spent much of his life involved in legal disputes over land and status. These experiences shaped his worldview. He repeatedly clashed with colonial officials, such as corregidores, and with local priests. In the late 1590s, he appealed as a plaintiff in a series of lawsuits attempting to recover land and political title in the Chupas Valley that he believed belonged to his family. And these suits proved disastrous because not only did he lose them, but in 1600 he was stripped of his property and forced into exile from towns he had once ruled as a noble. Spanish colonial rule in the Andes rested on several key institutions. The encomienda system granted Spaniards the right to collect tribute and labor from indigenous communities. The mita forced indigenous men into labor drafts, particularly in mining regions like Potosi, and the repartimiento de mercancías compelled indigenous communities to purchase goods from colonial officials at inflated prices. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church conducted campaigns against what it called idolatry, attempting to suppress indigenous religious traditions. While some clergy defended indigenous communities, others were widely criticized for corruption or abuse. For people like Guaman Poma, this meant living in a world where Spanish officials, Spanish law, and Spanish priests exercised enormous power over indigenous land, labor, and daily life. His chronicle can therefore be understood partly as an attempt to bypass local corruption by appealing directly to the king. Guaman Poma wrote primarily in Spanish, but his language often incorporates Quechua words and Andean concepts. His voice is therefore hybrid. He uses the colonizer's language to criticize colonialism itself. His personal struggles over land mirror a broader pattern: the dispossession of indigenous communities throughout the Andes. The Nueva Corónica also presents colonial history very differently from Spanish chronicles. Spanish authors often portrayed the conquest as the spread of civilization and Christianity. Guaman Poma tells a different story. Spaniards claim they brought order; he shows disorder after conquest. Spaniards claim tribute systems were fair; he documents exploitation and suffering. Spaniards claimed moral authority; he exposes the corruption of priests and colonial officials. His manuscript therefore becomes both historical record and moral argument, a counter-history of colonial rule. Guaman Poma insists that Andean society possessed complex political institutions, social organization, and moral traditions long before the Spanish arrived. In his telling, the Andes had a civilization of its own, and Spanish rule often produced chaos rather than improvement. The illustrations play a crucial role in making this argument. One image depicts a corrupt priest abusing his authority during confession. Guaman Poma accuses some priests of drinking, gambling, beating indigenous people, and exploiting women. Here he uses Christian moral language to expose hypocrisy. He's not rejecting Christianity itself. Instead, he argues that colonial authorities fail to live up to the moral principles they claim to represent. Another illustration depicts a solitary indigenous woman identified as a tejedora, or female weaver, and the accompanying text describes her as a 33-year-old woman and a tribute woman, meaning she was required to produce goods, especially textiles, as part of the colonial tribute system imposed by the Spanish. She is shown kneeling with her back straight, working at a loom tied to a tree. And in Andean society, weaving was not merely a domestic task. Textile production carried deep spiritual, social, and economic meaning. Patterns and symbols woven into cloth often conveyed cultural narratives and spiritual beliefs. Under colonial rule, however, women like this weaver were compelled to direct their skilled labor towards fulfilling tribute obligations. Indigenous women thus became essential to the colonial economy. At the same time, weaving remained a means of survival and a way to maintain elements of Andean cultural identity. By describing her as a tribute woman, Guaman Poma highlights both the exploitative demands placed upon her and her role as a cultural agent preserving indigenous traditions. These images remind us that the manuscript is not simply a written chronicle, it is also a visual archive of colonial life. Guaman Poma often shifts between I and we in his writing. Although he tells his own story, he frequently presents himself as speaking for indigenous communities more broadly. His chronicle therefore operates almost like a collective testimony, documenting the suffering and resilience of Andean society under colonial rule. At the same time, he insists that justice is still possible. His proposals for good government imagine a reformed colonial system in which the king protects indigenous communities and punishes corrupt officials. From a modern perspective, the manuscript also reveals striking cultural hybridity. Guaman Poma blends Andean traditions with Christian and European ideas. Biblical stories appear alongside Inca history. Christian moral language is used to condemn colonial abuses. Spanish writing conventions coexist with Quechua vocabulary and Andean perspectives. This hybrid voice challenges colonial authority and reminds us that colonial narratives were never uncontested. There is also a striking irony in the manuscript's history. Guaman Poma devoted enormous effort to writing a letter to the king, yet the king never read it. And yet, despite being ignored in its own time, the manuscript has become one of the most important sources for historians of colonial Latin America. Today, when we read the Nueva Corónica, we become the audience Guaman Poma never had. We see the abuses he documented, the moral arguments he constructed, and the vision of justice he imagined. His work also fits into a broader tradition of critique within the Spanish Empire. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas denounce Spanish brutality in the Americas. Guaman Poma's chronicle shows that indigenous intellectuals were also producing powerful critiques of empire. So why is this text so important? It is one of the few surviving chronicles written by an indigenous author in colonial Peru. It provides extraordinary detail about daily life in the colonial Andes. It preserves indigenous perspectives that were often excluded from official records. And it demonstrates how colonized subjects use writing itself as a form of resistance. For historians and students alike, reading Guaman Poma means learning to listen to voices that empire tried to silence. Whose stories survive? Whose stories were buried? And what happens when those stories resurface centuries later? Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala's Nueva Corónica y Buen Gobierno is not just a chronicle. It's a protest, a counter-history, and a vision of justice. It exposes colonial exploitation, but it also reveals resilience, creativity, and intellectual resistance. And when we read it today, we are not just studying the past. We are entering into a conversation with someone who lived through colonization and refused to let that experience go unrecorded. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you.